Have you noticed that horror movies keep winning? Not just surviving, not just quietly making money in the background, winning. For years, horror was treated like a weird cousin of the movie industry. Studios loved the profits, but critics often looked down on the genre, award shows mostly ignored it, and plenty of movie fans would casually dismiss horror as jump scares, screaming teenagers, and people making spectacularly bad decisions in dark basements. And yet somehow, horror has become one of the most reliable genres in modern cinema. While expensive blockbusters struggle to break even, horror movies keep showing up with modest budgets, original ideas, and massive profits. So what's happening? Why is horror suddenly everywhere? Why are audiences embracing it more than ever? And why might horror be the genre that's quietly saving Hollywood? Let's start with the money, because Hollywood certainly does. One of the biggest advantages horror has is that it doesn't need a billion-dollar spectacle to work. A movie can take place in a house, a forest, a school, a church, a creepy hallway that somebody found behind a warehouse for free. Fear doesn't require expensive visual effects. Sometimes it barely requires lighting. Compare that to a modern blockbuster. Superhero movies, action films, and fantasy epics often need budgets that stretch well beyond $100 million. Sometimes they need much more. That means they need enormous audiences just to break even. Horror operates under a completely different set of rules. If a horror film costs $10 million and makes $50 million, that's a huge success. If it costs $5 million and makes $100 million, executives start smiling in a way that should probably qualify as body horror. We've seen this repeatedly. Think about The Blair Witch Project, a tiny movie that became a phenomenon. Paranormal Activity, a film made for what was essentially the catering budget of a superhero movie. Insidious, The Purge, and countless others. The formula has existed for decades, but recently it feels like the entire industry has rediscovered it. Take Longlegs. On paper, it looked unusual. It wasn't based on a comic book. It wasn't a sequel. It wasn't part of a cinematic universe. It was simply a strange, unsettling horror film with an eerie marketing campaign and a memorable performance from Nicolas Cage. And audiences showed up. The film became one of the biggest horror success stories of its year and proved that viewers were still hungry for original horror experiences. Then there was Terrifier 3. Now, regardless of whether you personally enjoy watching a killer clown commit acts that would make a medieval torture manual say, okay, that's a bit much, the film's success was impossible to ignore. An unrated independent horror movie competing against major studio releases sounds like the setup for a cautionary tale, but instead, it became a box office success story. The movie opened at #1 and demonstrated something horror fans have known for years. If a horror movie creates enough buzz, audiences will find it. They don't care whether it comes with a giant marketing campaign or an established franchise. They care whether it looks interesting, terrifying, or outrageous enough to justify a theater ticket. Horror has developed one of the most loyal audiences in entertainment, but horror isn't only winning because it's cheap, it's winning because it's adaptable. Horror can be almost anything. Want a social thriller? Horror can do that. Want a period drama? Yeah, you can do that too. Want science fiction, comedy, romance, action, mystery, or a psychological drama? Horror can absorb all of them, like some cinematic shape-shifting monster. Look at Jordan Peele's Get Out. It worked as horror, it worked as satire, it worked as social commentary, it worked as a mystery. Different audiences came away discussing different aspects of the same movie. That's one of horror's greatest strengths. Fear is universal. You can attach it to almost any story and instantly raise the stakes. A romantic comedy asks whether two people will get together. A horror movie asks if two people will get together and survive the night. That's efficient storytelling. And filmmakers have been taking advantage of that flexibility. What makes modern horror especially interesting is how comfortable it has become tackling subjects that traditionally belong to serious dramas. Take Hereditary. On the surface, it's a supernatural horror film, but what people really remember is the feeling of a family falling apart under the weight of grief. The scares work because the emotional foundation is already there. You can see something similar in The Witch. Yes, there's a witch. The title doesn't exactly hide that fact, but the real tension comes from watching isolation and paranoia slowly destroy a family from the inside out. By the time the supernatural elements fully emerge, the family has practically done half the monster's work for it. Then you have films like His House, which uses horror to explore the immigrant experience and trauma of displacement. The fear isn't just coming from what may be lurking in the shadows, it's also coming from the characters' struggle to build a new life while carrying the weight of everything they've left behind. Even The Babadook works this way. The monster is memorable, but the reason the film resonates is because it's fundamentally about grief, depression, and emotional exhaustion. The horror gives those feelings a physical form. That's become one of modern horror's greatest strengths. The monsters matter, the scares matter, but increasingly, the best horror movies are also about something deeper. Another reason horror is thriving may be that reality has become increasingly unpredictable. Historically, horror tends to do well in periods where people feel uncertain about the world around them. And let's be honest, the last couple of decades have provided plenty of material. People worry about technology, they worry about social change, they worry about economic instability, they worry about the future in general. Sometimes it feels like we're all carrying around a low-level sense of anxiety that's just permanently running in the background. Horror provides a way to channel those feelings into something tangible. Instead of dealing with a vague sense of unease, you spend 2 hours confronting a specific monster, ghost, creature, or threat. It's a controlled experience. The audience gets to feel fear in an environment where they know they'll ultimately be safe. That's part of why horror feels so relevant. The monsters change, but they're frequently reflecting whatever people are already worried about. And audiences seem to be responding. What's particularly fascinating is that horror is no longer confined to hardcore horror fans. Movies like Quiet Place attracted mainstream audiences. So did Smile. So did Megan. People who rarely watch horror suddenly found themselves discussing horror movies at work, at school, and online. And speaking of online, we need to talk about the internet, which has also transformed the way horror spreads. Think about how horror naturally works online. A creepy image gets shared, someone posts a disturbing theory, a strange video appears in people's feeds. Before long, thousands or even millions of people are discussing it. Horror is almost perfectly designed for social media because people love sharing things that surprise them, unsettle them, or make them immediately message a friend with the words, "You need to see this." That's helped create an entirely new generation of horror fans. Many younger viewers didn't grow up discovering horror exclusively through movie theaters. They encountered creepypastas, found footage videos, analog horror projects, liminal space photography, and internet mysteries long before Hollywood got involved. Now we're seeing that influence move in the opposite direction, with internet-born horror concepts finding their way into mainstream filmmaking. The gap between online horror culture and traditional cinema keeps getting smaller. And this brings us to one of the most important developments in the genre: originality. Hollywood loves intellectual property. Sequels, prequels, reboots, remakes, spin-offs, reimaginations, legacy sequels, soft reboots, hard reboots. But horror remains one of the few genres where original stories can still break through. Sinners is perhaps the best recent example. An original horror film, no pre-existing franchise, no cinematic universe, no decades of established lore, just a compelling concept, strong filmmaking, and excellent word of mouth. The result was one of the biggest horror success stories in recent memory, becoming a major box office phenomenon and demonstrating that audiences will still embrace original ideas when they're executed well. That's incredibly important because horror has become a testing ground for new filmmakers. If you're a young director with a great idea, horror remains one of the few places where you can realistically get a movie made. Studios are often willing to take chances because the budgets are lower, The financial risk is manageable, and if the film succeeds, the rewards can be enormous. One of the most important consequences of all this success is that horror has become an incredible launching pad for filmmakers. Because budgets are relatively manageable, studios are often more willing to take chances on new voices. That creates opportunities that are increasingly rare elsewhere in the industry. We've seen it happen repeatedly. James Wan built a reputation through horror before becoming one of Hollywood's most commercially successful directors. Jordan Peele used horror to establish himself as one of the most distinctive filmmakers working today. Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, Zach Cregger all demonstrated how a strong horror film can instantly put a director on the industry's radar. The pattern keeps repeating because horror rewards imagination more than scale. A filmmaker doesn't necessarily need the biggest budget, they need an idea that audiences haven't seen before. And audiences notice. In fact, horror audiences are often more adventurous than general movie audience. They actively seek out new concepts, new monsters, new directors, new styles. If somebody tells a horror fan there's a movie about a haunted videotape, an invisible entity, or a killer smile, a possessed toy, or a vampire musical period drama set in the American South, their response is usually not, "That sounds ridiculous." Their response is, "What time does it start?" That's a powerful advantage, and it helps explain why horror keeps evolving while other genres sometimes feel trapped by expectations. Another fascinating shift is critical respect. For decades, horror struggled to gain recognition from major institutions. Today, that's changing. Films like Get Out, The Substance, Sinners, and others have received serious critical attention. Critics increasingly recognize that horror can be artistically ambitious, emotionally complex, and culturally relevant. The old distinction between prestige cinema and horror cinema is becoming harder to maintain. And honestly, that's probably overdue. A great horror film requires directing, writing, editing, cinematography, sound design, music, production design, and acting, all working together with extraordinary precision. A comedy can survive a weak jump scare. A horror movie cannot survive weak tension. The craft has always been there, people are finally acknowledging it. So where does all of this leave us? When you step back and look at the bigger picture, horror success starts to make a lot of sense. The genre can be produced without enormous budgets, it gives filmmakers room to experiment, it adapts to changing cultural conversations, it generates strong audience reactions and sparks discussion long after people leave the theater. Most importantly, it remains one of the few corners of the industry where originality still has a genuine chance to break through. That's why horror keeps producing surprise hits. That's why new directors continue gravitating towards it. And that's why studios keep coming back, even when trends elsewhere seem to be shifting every few years. Horror isn't succeeding despite being different from the rest of Hollywood. It's succeeding because it's different. For decades, horror was treated like the underdog. Now the underdog is filling theaters, generating profits, launching careers, influencing popular culture, and proving that audiences still crave original stories. Not bad for a genre that spent most of its history being told it wasn't respectable. Turns out that horror didn't need respect, it just needed the chance to prove what it could do. And now, while much of Hollywood is searching for the next big thing, horror has quietly become exactly that. So is the shift toward horror a trend that will last, or just a passing Hollywood trend? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you feel like dropping a like or subscribe, that's much appreciated.